The baby kept screaming and refusing to eat, until an old woman slowly walked in, and suddenly the room fell silent. Clara Mae Simmons stepped off the bus with a slow stride and a nervous heart. Her wrinkled hand gripped the handle of a faded brown bag. It was a hot day in New York City, but the heat did little to melt the anxiety in her chest. At over 50 years old, Clara had seen the world change in many ways. But deep in her heart, she still carried one thing unchanged, a quiet, unwavering love for children. She hadn't come to the city for a vacation. Clara had just been hired as a nanny by the Montgomery family, one of the wealthiest households in Manhattan. They lived in a luxury penthouse overlooking Central Park, surrounded by gold-trimmed glass walls and the kind of silence that only wealth could afford. It wasn't Clara's world, but she had stepped into it. To survive, a sleek black car was waiting for her at the station. The driver, dressed in full black uniform, opened the door without saying a word. Inside the vehicle, there was no conversation, only the soft hum of cold air from vents and the faint scent of polished leather. When they arrived at Montgomery Tower, Clara was taken up in a private elevator. At the penthouse door, a woman stood tall, dressed in a tight white dress and flawless makeup. Her eyes were sharp. Her lips were thin and red. This was Rachel Montgomery. "You're Clara?" she asked flatly. "Yes, ma'am," Clara answered politely, her smile gentle. "Come in. I don't tolerate delays. Let me show you your place and the baby's schedule." Rachel didn't offer tea. She didn't ask how the trip was. Instead, she opened a large binder filled with typed regulations and schedules. Clara sat on a wicker chair, hands folded, quietly listening. Then her eyes paused on one bolded sentence halfway down the page. "Do not speak unless spoken to." She stared at the words for a long moment. Her heart slowed. Still, she said nothing. She simply nodded once. Rachel closed the binder with a snap. "You'll be paid well, Miss Simmons. But remember, silence is golden in this house." "Yes, ma'am," Clara repeated softly. She was shown a tiny room next to the kitchen. No windows, a single bed, a small wooden wardrobe. But it was enough. Clara placed her bag down, removed her shoes, and took a deep breath. She knew this wasn't about comfort. This was about the child she had come to care for. A few minutes later, the door creaked open. "Come, you'll meet Madison now," Rachel said, already walking away. Clara followed her down the marble hallway to the nursery. The room was wide and pastel-colored, filled with plush toys and designer furnishings. In the center sat a baby girl, perched in a high chair, staring into the distance. Her cheeks were round, her hair soft and golden, her eyes a pale blue, but her expression wasn't joyful. Rachel crossed her arms. "She hasn't been sleeping well. Not eating much either. We tried everything." Clara walked forward gently. She looked into the baby's eyes, then slowly bent down, placing one finger softly against the child's cheek, and whispered, "Hello there, little sunshine." Rachel stiffened. "Did you not read the rule?" Clara quickly drew back her hand. "Yes, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am." Rachel rolled her eyes. "Don't do that again. You're here to feed and clean, not to entertain." Clara stepped back and reached for the baby bottle. She tried feeding Madison. The baby turned her face, crying, screaming, pushing the bottle away. Rachel huffed. "Useless. She's always like this." Clara stood still, watching Madison with quiet eyes. In her mind, she began humming an old lullaby, one passed down from her mother, a melody from Georgia she used to sing to neighborhood children. But she didn't dare let it escape her lips. Inside the walls of the silent mansion, Clara already understood. This baby didn't need more toys, or gourmet meals, or gold-trimmed bottles. She needed something that hadn't touched this house in a long, long time. A voice, a song, a mother's warmth. Clara sighed. Her journey had only just begun. The Montgomery penthouse was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the skyline of Manhattan in every direction. Marble floors, glass sculptures, and silent halls echoed wealth at every turn. But beneath the luxury, Clara felt it from her first night. The house was cold, not in temperature, but in spirit. No one smiled. No one laughed. The staff moved like shadows, eyes lowered, footsteps hushed. Clara barely heard a voice the entire day, other than sharp commands from Rachel or the occasional instructions from the house manager, a man named Edwin who barely looked her in the eye. That night, Clara lay awake on her narrow bed. The light from the hallway crept under her door. Somewhere above, Madison was crying again. Clara rolled to her side, hands folded over her chest. Her instinct urged her to go, but the rule echoed in her mind. Do not speak unless spoken to. She stayed where she was. The next morning, Rachel handed her the feeding schedule. Madison was to eat at 7, 10, 1, 4, and 7 again. Clara nodded. She walked into the nursery at exactly 10 a.m., wearing her plain apron and soft slippers. The baby was sitting up in her high chair, a tiny bib around her neck, and 2 untouched spoons of mashed carrot on the tray in front of her. Clara sat down quietly and picked up the spoon. "Good morning, baby girl," she whispered without thinking, then immediately bit her lip. Madison didn't move. Clara offered the spoon. Madison turned her face away. Clara waited a moment, then gently hummed a single line from her favorite lullaby, her voice barely audible. Madison turned back toward her. It was small, just a glance. But in that instant, Clara saw something. Recognition. Memory. As if Madison knew the melody. Knew her. Clara whispered again, even softer. "It's all right, sugar. I'm right here." Madison opened her mouth. The spoon went in. Then another. Then another. Slowly. Gently. The baby began to eat, her first real bites in days. At that moment, Rachel appeared in the doorway. "What did I just hear?" she asked sharply. Clara stood, startled. She was hungry, ma'am." "I said no talking," Rachel snapped. "She's a baby. You don't need to talk to feed her." "Yes, ma'am," Clara said, bowing her head. Rachel walked over, took the spoon from Clara's hand, and tried to continue feeding Madison. The baby immediately turned away. Rachel tried again. Madison cried. Then she wailed. Rachel groaned. "I don't have time for this." She left the room muttering, "She always does this. You figure it out. Just don't speak." Clara sat back down, shaken. The spoon was still warm in her hand. She looked into Madison's wet, red eyes. Then she did what she knew how to do, the only thing that had ever worked. She sang. Not loud, just a gentle hum, almost like breathing. Madison stopped crying. Slowly, she reached for the spoon. Clara fed her again, bite after bite. Then, without thinking, Clara whispered, "You just needed a little love, didn't you, baby?" And that was the moment it began. The bond no one could see. The language no one in the house understood. A song, a voice, a warmth. But it was also the beginning of something else. Because later that evening, someone would overhear Clara's voice through the baby monitor. And nothing in the house would be the same after that. The sun dipped behind the skyline, casting long orange streaks across the penthouse windows. Dinner was being served downstairs, but Clara remained in the nursery. Madison had just finished her evening feeding and was drifting into a light sleep in Clara's arms. Clara rocked her gently, humming that same soft melody she once heard from her own mother. Madison's breathing grew steady. Her little hands rested on Clara's chest. Her lips parted slightly, as if to whisper thank you in her own infant way. Clara didn't hear the soft click on the other side of the room. It was the sound of a monitor, small, sleek, and wireless, sitting quietly on a shelf above the changing table. The blinking red light meant it was live. A signal had been activated from the main control panel in the master bedroom. Downstairs, Rachel Montgomery was sitting on a velvet chaise, holding a tablet with the video feed open. The screen showed a dimly lit nursery. A faint melody hummed in the background. She narrowed her eyes. The voice was unmistakable. She turned up the volume. "Sleep now, little angel," Clara whispered, still swaying with Madison. "You're safe." Rachel sat upright. She tapped the screen. The baby was clearly responding to the woman's voice, smiling in her sleep, completely calm. Rachel had never seen her daughter that peaceful. Not once. Not with the chef's food, not with the expensive lullaby app. not even with her own embrace. And yet, the emotion Rachel felt wasn't gratitude. It was something else. Control. She closed the tablet and stood up, heels clicking against the marble floor. Her jaw clenched. Clara was breaking the rule. The next morning came with a chill. Clara arrived early in the nursery, as always, ready to prepare the first feeding. But she was stopped by Edwin, the house manager. "Mrs. Montgomery would like to speak with you," he said. Clara nodded and followed him down the long hallway. When she entered the study, Rachel was waiting by the window, back turned, arms crossed. "You were heard speaking yesterday," Rachel said coldly. Clara stood still. "Ma'am, I was only—" "You were singing." Clara hesitated. "Yes, ma'am." Rachel turned to face her. "I told you not to speak unless spoken to. I was clear. Was I not?" Clara nodded slowly. "You were, ma'am. Then why did you break the rule?" There was a pause. Clara looked down at her hands, then answered with a voice steady and soft. "Because the baby was hungry and hurting, and nothing else worked." Rachel's lips tightened. Clara continued. "She needed a voice, a gentle one. That's all." Rachel walked closer. "Let me make this clear. You are not here to heal my child. You are here to follow instructions. Feed, bathe, change, nothing more." Clara swallowed the lump in her throat. "Yes, ma'am." Rachel waved her hand. "You're dismissed." As Clara stepped out of the room, Edwin gave her a sympathetic glance. But sympathy meant nothing here. Not in this house. Not when silence was the only currency. That afternoon, Clara returned to the nursery. Madison was crying again. Rachel had taken over feeding duties for the day, a form of punishment. Clara stood in the corner, quietly folding baby clothes. Spoon after spoon, Madison refused. She swatted at her mother's hand, turned her face, screamed. The tension grew. Rachel huffed. "She's impossible." She stood and stormed out, leaving the half-full bowl on the table. Clara looked at the clock. 12:43 p.m. She waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. Madison continued to cry, her face red, her tiny fists balled tight. Then Clara walked to her, lifted her gently, and held her close. She didn't speak. Not yet. She only hummed. The baby calmed. Clara picked up the spoon. Madison opened her mouth. But across the hall, behind a cracked open door, a man had been watching. Jonathan Montgomery, the father, and for the first time, he began to question the silence in his home. Jonathan Montgomery was not a man who paid close attention to details at home. He ran a chain of international tech companies, oversaw hundreds of employees, and made billion-dollar decisions over breakfast. His presence at the penthouse was usually limited to late-night arrivals and early morning departures. But ever since Madison had started refusing food and screaming through the night, even Jonathan couldn't ignore what was happening under his own roof. He had returned early that day, hoping to spend time with his daughter, and instead, he found her sobbing while Rachel slammed a silver spoon on the counter. "She won't eat again," Rachel had snapped. "I'm done." Then she left the room in frustration. Jonathan remained. Quiet. He didn't step in. He watched, and from the shadows of the hallway, he saw Clara, the quiet woman with soft hands and an older face, approach the baby. No words, just a hum, a lullaby older than time. He didn't recognize the tune, but it had a pulse, a rhythm that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than music. Madison responded instantly. Jonathan watched as his daughter stopped crying, as her eyes opened and locked with Clara's, as her tiny mouth opened again for the spoon. One bite, then another, then another. He was stunned. That night, after dinner, Jonathan sat alone in his study. His mind couldn't shake what he had seen. His daughter had never looked so calm. Not with him. Not with Rachel. Not even with the expensive consultants they had flown in from Boston. He opened his laptop. Then he opened the household surveillance files. At first, he felt guilty, but curiosity won. He found the nursery feed, time-stamped at 10:03 a.m., the time of Madison's last feeding. He pressed play. The screen flickered to life. There was Clara rocking the baby. The same soft hum echoed through the speakers. Her voice was gentle, measured, like velvet wrapped around each note. Jonathan turned up the volume, and as he watched Madison nestle against Clara's chest, slowly drifting to sleep, something inside him cracked. A quiet realization, a feeling he didn't expect. His baby had never been at peace. Not until that moment. Later that evening, he joined Rachel in the master bedroom. She was brushing her hair at her vanity, scrolling through her phone. "I watched the nursery feed," Jonathan said. Rachel didn't look up. "Oh," she sings to her. Rachel finally turned. "Yes, I know. We've talked about it. She's been told not to." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "She's the only one who can feed our daughter." Rachel stood, folding her arms. She broke the rule. He walked toward the window, hands in his pockets. Maybe the rule is wrong. Rachel's eyes narrowed. She's overstepping. Jonathan turned slowly to face her. "No, she's mothering." The word cut through the room like glass. Rachel stepped back, lips tightening. "Excuse me." Jonathan didn't speak again. The room filled with silence. The kind of silence that didn't come from obedience, but from something more dangerous: disagreement. The next morning, Clara was called to the kitchen. Jonathan was waiting at the table with a cup of coffee. His tie was loose, his eyes tired. "Sit down, Miss Simmons," he said kindly. Clara hesitated, then slowly took a seat. He looked at her for a long moment, then asked, "How did you know?" Clara folded her hands. "Know what, sir?" "That she needed your voice." Clara breathed slowly. "I didn't know, sir. I just listened." Jonathan nodded. "That song, where's it from?" "Georgia, sir. My mother used to sing it, and her mother before her." He leaned forward. "You're helping her more than any doctor has." Clara looked down. "Thank you, sir. But your wife—" "I'll speak to Rachel," he interrupted. He stood, smoothing his blazer. "From now on, I'd like you to do what's best for Madison. Speak if needed. Sing if it helps. You don't need permission." Clara's heart beat faster. "Yes, sir." As he left the room, Clara sat alone at the table, hands trembling slightly. It was the first time someone in that house had told her to speak freely. But what she didn't know was that Rachel had been standing outside the kitchen door, and she had heard every word. The next few days passed like a strange dance. Clara continued to care for Madison as she always had. Gently, patiently, with a heart full of softness and a voice she no longer had to bury. She sang in whispers while feeding, hummed lullabies during nap time, and spoke tender words while changing diapers. The baby responded in kind, eating full meals, sleeping soundly, even giggling for first time in weeks. Rachel noticed. Everyone noticed. The house, once sterile and clinical, now had a pulse. But Rachel didn't smile. Instead, she watched. From doorways, through monitors, behind the frosted glass of her office. Every time Clara's voice echoed through the halls, every time Madison cooed or laughed, Rachel's jaw tightened just a little more. At dinner, Jonathan remarked casually, "Madison ate a full bowl today." Rachel sipped her wine. "How lovely. She's really responding to Clara's presence," he continued. Rachel nodded. "For now." Jonathan gave her a look. "What does that mean?" Rachel set down her glass. "It means this is temporary. We can't rely on a woman like her forever." "A woman like her?" Jonathan repeated. Rachel paused. "I meant someone outside the family." He didn't push, but her words hung heavy in the air. The following morning, Clara entered the nursery and found something new. A small speaker system had been installed in the corner of the room. Alongside it, a sleek touchscreen mounted on the wall. Edwin was there, setting up the device. "Mrs. Montgomery's idea," he explained. "She wants the baby to get used to professional audio stimulation, classical music, white noise, that sort of thing." Clara smiled politely. "Of course." After Edwin left, Clara approached the machine. She tapped the screen. Dozens of playlists glowed to life. Mozart, Beethoven, ambient soundscapes, rainforest noises. She sighed. Later that afternoon, during the 1 p.m. feeding, Clara sat in a rocking chair, Madison nestled in her arms. The playlist played softly in the background, a symphony of violins and cellos. Madison turned her face away from the spoon. Clara tried again. The baby refused. A third time, the baby began to cry. Clara glanced at the monitor. She knew Rachel was watching. Her fingers trembled, and then she made a choice. She reached over, turned off the speaker, and began to hum. A low, gentle tune. The same melody. The same warmth. Madison stopped crying. She opened her mouth. Spoon after spoon, the bowl emptied. Upstairs, Rachel watched the live feed. Her eyes narrowed. She stood up and left the room. By the time she reached the nursery, Clara was burping Madison over her shoulder. The room was quiet again, not because of technology, but because of a voice. Rachel walked in without knocking. Clara froze. "Miss Simmons," Rachel said, calm and sharp. "Yes, ma'am. I gave you very clear instructions about the music system." Clara stood. "Yes, ma'am. But she is my child." Rachel cut in. "Not yours. And I will decide what's best for her." Clara's hands instinctively shielded Madison's back, holding her closer. She didn't speak. Rachel continued. "You become too comfortable, too familiar. That's dangerous." Clara's lips parted slightly. "I only did what helped her, ma'am." Rachel stepped forward. "You are paid to follow rules, not to parent." There was a long silence. Then Rachel leaned in, her voice low and cold. "If you want to keep your job, you will stay quiet. Do you understand me?" Clara nodded, slowly. "Yes, ma'am." Rachel turned and left. But as the door closed behind her, Madison stirred in Clara's arms. The baby reached up and touched Clara's cheek. And though no one else saw it, though there were no monitors, no screens, no witnesses, Clara smiled. Because in that small touch, the child had said what no one else dared to. "I trust you." Tension began to crackle through the Montgomery household like a silent storm. To the outside world, the family remained perfect, powerful, polished, pristine. But inside, the lines were being drawn. Rachel and Clara never clashed openly, but everyone in the house could feel it. The glances, the pauses, the sudden chill in the room when both women were present. Rachel didn't fire Clara. Not yet. She couldn't, because Madison had begun refusing food from anyone else. No matter who held the spoon, the private chef, Edwin, even Rachel herself, the baby screamed. Arched her back. Clench her mouth. The only one who could calm her, feed her, settle her, was Clara. Rachel hated it. She tried everything else. Organic purees from Europe, hypoallergenic formulas, imported feeding utensils. A pediatric nutritionist even came to visit. Nothing worked. But when Clara entered the room and softly hummed that old Southern lullaby, Madison opened her mouth like it was magic. One morning, Jonathan found Rachel standing by the window with tears in her eyes. He walked over and gently asked, "What's wrong?" Rachel didn't look at him. "I'm her mother, Jonathan, but she looks for the nanny." Jonathan placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're still learning." "We both are." I followed every book, every rule, every plan. I didn't even hire Clara. The agency did. I never wanted this. Jonathan was quiet. Rachel turned to him, voice trembling. "Do you think she loves Clara more than me?" He took a moment before answering. "I think Madison loves who makes her feel safe." Rachel pulled away, wounded. "That's not fair." Jonathan replied softly, "No, but it's true." Later that day, Rachel called Edwin to her private office. "I want Clara gone," she said. Edwin blinked. "But ma'am, the child." "I don't care. We'll bring in someone new. This is my house. My child." Edwin hesitated. "Shall I inform Mr. Montgomery?" Rachel's eyes flashed. "No, this is my decision. Clara will be gone by the end of the week." That night, Clara sat alone in her room. She had sensed it coming. The way Rachel looked at her had changed. Not just cold, but threatened, like Clara had taken something that wasn't hers. She folded Madison's tiny clothes slowly, placing them into drawers one by one. A small tear rolled down her cheek. She had never wanted to replace anyone. She only wanted to help. The next morning, Clara was summoned again. Rachel didn't speak much, only handed her an envelope. "Your notice," she said. "You'll be paid for the month. We'll make arrangements for the next nanny." Clara stood still. "Yes, ma'am." Rachel added, "You'll not be saying goodbye to Madison. I don't want her confused." Clara nodded once. Understood. Then she walked away, not out of anger, but heartbreak. She passed Edwin in the hallway. His eyes dropped in quiet apology. She passed the nursery door, hearing Madison's soft cries inside, and she kept walking, down the elevator, out the lobby, into the cold morning air. She didn't look back, but the silence she left behind was deeper than anything Rachel had ever demanded. The house felt different without Clara. It wasn't something anyone spoke about aloud, but it was in the walls, the silence, the stillness, a heaviness that pressed down on every room like thick fog. Most of all, it was in Madison. The baby cried that morning, and cried that afternoon, and cried again that night. The new nanny, a polished young woman named Justine, tried every trick she had. Warm milk, soft toys, gentle rocking, classical music. Nothing worked. By the second day, Madison refused to eat. Her lips stayed shut. Her little fists clenched tightly at her sides. Every bottle was swatted away. Every attempt to spoon-feed ended in screams. Rachel stood outside the nursery, listening with growing dread. "She'll adjust," she said aloud, though no one was there to believe her. By the third day, the pediatrician was called. "She seems distressed," the doctor said. "This kind of separation anxiety isn't uncommon, but it's severe in her case. Is she missing someone?" Rachel said nothing. The doctor left with a printed list of recommendations. None of them would matter, because Madison was growing weaker. That evening, Jonathan returned from a business trip. He walked into nursery and found his daughter slumped in her crib, her cheeks flushed from crying, her breathing shallow. She looked up at him and didn't smile. "Where's Clara?" he asked. Rachel didn't answer. "Rachel," he repeated, voice harder. "Where is she?" "She's gone," Rachel said flatly. "I let her go." Jonathan's voice was sharp. "You what?" "I had to," she snapped. She was becoming too important. Madison wouldn't even look at me. "I'm her mother, Jonathan." Jonathan stepped forward. "And instead of learning from Clara, you punished her? You punished Madison. She was replacing me." "No, Rachel. She was doing what you couldn't." Rachel's eyes burned. "How dare you?" But Jonathan had already turned away. He walked straight to his phone and dialed Edwin. "Find Clara. Now." Clara, meanwhile, was in her small apartment in Harlem. She hadn't unpacked her bag, hadn't eaten much. She spent most of her time sitting by the window, her hands folded, staring at the city lights. She missed the child more than she could explain. Not just the softness of her hands or the sound of her tiny giggle, but the connection, the trust, the feeling that, in some small way, she had mattered again. When a knock came at the door, Clara thought it was the landlord, but it was Edwin, panting, eyes wide, holding his phone in one hand. "They need you. Now." Clara blinked. "What's wrong?" Edwin swallowed. "She hasn't eaten in 3 days." An hour later, Clara stood once again in the grand hallway of the Montgomery penthouse. The housekeeper opened the door, eyes red from worry. No one said anything as Clara made her way to the nursery. She found Madison lying in her crib, pale and exhausted, barely whimpering. Clara stepped forward slowly. The child turned her head, and their eyes met. A gasp escaped Madison's lips. She reached out. Clara bent down, lifted her gently, and began to hum. That old tune, the same melody Madison had memorized in her bones. The baby sighed and nestled into Clara's chest. Jonathan stood in the doorway, watching in disbelief. Rachel was behind him, tears pooling in her eyes. They said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. In less than 3 minutes, Clara had done what no one else in the house could do in 3 days. She fed her, and Madison ate, every spoon, every drop. After that night, everything changed. The tension that once filled the penthouse began to soften, not with words, but through the silent surrender that only truth could bring. No one questioned Clara's presence anymore. She was no longer just the nanny. She was a thread that held the fabric of that household together. Clara didn't ask for her job back. No one formally offered it either. She simply stayed. The next morning, Madison woke up smiling. Her tiny fingers searched the air until Clara's hand gently wrapped around them. The baby opened her mouth without hesitation when the spoon appeared, responding once more to the humming lullaby that had become her personal language of comfort. Rachel stood outside the door, watching through a narrow crack. She hadn't slept much. She looked tired, older, uncertain. Later that day, she called for Clara. The two women sat across from each other in the same kitchen where Rachel had once handed Clara her dismissal envelope. The same marble countertop, the same silence. But now, Clara's presence felt larger, and Rachel's smaller. "I was wrong," Rachel said softly. Clara didn't respond. She simply waited. Rachel looked down at her hands. "I thought I was protecting my place in my daughter's life, but I see now I wasn't even part of it." Clara's voice was calm. "She doesn't need perfect, ma'am. She needs real." Rachel nodded, eyes misty. "Can you help me? I mean, not just feed her, but help me learn how to be what she needs." Clara's face didn't change, but her heart did. She nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." The days that followed were different. Clara no longer worked in the shadows. She and Rachel began spending time together with Madison, feeding her side by side, rocking her together, even laughing now and then. Clara taught Rachel how to hold the bottle with patience, how to recognize Madison's different cries, how to hum the lullaby just the right way. Rachel stumbled at first, but Clara never judged. And for the first time in her life, Rachel began to understand motherhood. Not from a book, not from a doctor, but from a woman society had taught her to overlook. One afternoon, Jonathan came home early. He found Rachel on the floor of the nursery, holding Madison while Clara sat beside them, humming. Rachel was singing along, off-key, timid, but present. Madison cooed. Jonathan smiled. And for a brief, perfect moment, the house fell whole. The house staff began to relax. Edwin returned to his usual stoic routine, but now greeted Clara with a respectful nod each morning. The housekeeper, who once tiptoed through rooms, now lingered a little longer just to hear Clara sing. Something was different now, not just in the baby, but in the adults. Clara's voice had reached places none of them knew needed healing. And yet, Clara never asked for credit. She still wore the same old shoes, still used the same brown leather bag, still folded Madison's clothes with quiet care. But the look in her eyes had changed. She knew she was valued. She knew she was seen. And that was enough. What no one else knew, not yet, was that Madison was about to change everything. Because what that little girl did next would leave everyone speechless. It was a Saturday morning, soft and quiet, the kind of morning that wrapped the city in calm. Sunlight poured into the nursery as Clara placed Madison in her favorite spot, the padded play rug near the window. Rachel sat nearby with a cup of warm tea, watching her daughter closely, her eyes carrying the same wonder one might reserve for something sacred. Clara settled beside Madison, shaking a soft rattle gently. "Good morning, sugar," she whispered. Madison reached for the toy with tiny fingers, her chubby cheeks glowing with contentment. Rachel smiled. "She's so different now. Happier." "She feels safe," Clara replied gently. "That's all any child needs." Madison babbled softly, sounds tumbling from her mouth like soft marbles. Not quite words, but something closer than before. She looked back and forth between Clara and Rachel. Then she did something no one expected. She looked directly at Clara and said, clear as day, "Nana." The room went still. Rachel's cup froze midair. Clara blinked. What did she? Madison clapped her hands and said it again, firmer this time. "Nana." Rachel gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. She dropped the teacup, porcelain shattering across the floor, but no one cared. Clara leaned in slowly, unsure she'd imagined it. Madison smiled wide and pointed. "Nana." Clara's throat tightened. Tears welled up in her eyes before she could stop them. She had raised dozens of children in her lifetime, nephews, neighbor kids, other people's babies, but no child had ever called her that. Not Mama, not Miss, not Nanny. Nana, something in between, something sacred. Rachel slowly stood, stepping carefully around the broken porcelain. She said her first word. She whispered. Clara wiped her cheek. "Yes, ma'am." "She chose you." Clara shook her head gently. "She chose us." Rachel knelt down beside her. The two women looked at each other, and for the first time, there was no class difference, no race line, no title, just two mothers. Two women raising the same child in the only way that ever truly worked. Together, that afternoon, Jonathan returned from his meeting. He was on the phone when Rachel met him at the door, her eyes still red from crying, but her smile brighter than he'd ever seen. "She spoke," Rachel said. Jonathan paused. "She what?" She spoke. Her first word. He dropped his phone. He didn't care. He ran down the hall and found Clara holding Madison, singing softly, tears still drying on her cheeks. Jonathan approached slowly. "What did she say?" he asked. Rachel answered before Clara could. She said, "Nana." Jonathan looked at Clara. Clara looked at Madison. And Madison giggled, clapping again. "Nana." That night, the three of them sat in the nursery. Rachel, Jonathan, and Clara. There was no music system playing, no artificial noise, no white noise machine, just voices, laughter, a lullaby, and the echo of a baby's first word, a word born not of duty or title but love. News of Madison's first word spread to the Montgomery household like light through a stained glass window. The staff smiled more often now. Even the security guards at the lobby entrance, who rarely showed emotion, began greeting Clara with a quiet nod of respect. Something had shifted, but the change wasn't just inside the home. It was in the city, in Rachel, and especially in Clara. For years, Clara had worked quietly in other people's homes. She had kept her voice low, her opinions to herself. She had folded clothes, cleaned cribs, boiled bottles, all without ever expecting thanks. She had accepted silence as her place. But now, something was different, because someone had finally spoken for her, and that someone was a child. The next day, Rachel made an unexpected request. She invited Clara to accompany her and Madison to a parenting group in Central Park, the kind frequented by high society mothers and their nannies who stayed 5 steps behind. Clara hesitated. Rachel noticed. "You'll sit with me," she said. "Not behind." Clara blinked. "Yes, ma'am." They arrived late, as usual. Traffic had been awful, but the moment they stepped out of the car, every head turned. Rachel Montgomery walking beside a black nanny wasn't rare. What was rare was this. Rachel Montgomery carrying her own baby and letting the nanny walk at her side, not behind. The other mothers glanced. Whispers flickered like sparks in dry grass. But Rachel didn't flinch. She laid out a blanket. Clara sat beside her. Madison crawled between them, clapping and babbling. She started stringing sounds. Clara whispered. "Won't be long before she says more." Rachel smiled. "Do you think she'll remember this?" Clara looked down at the baby. Maybe not in her mind, but in her heart, always. The other mothers began inching closer. One woman leaned over. "Excuse me, is that your nanny?" Rachel turned, eyes calm. "That's Clara. She helped save my daughter's life." Another woman whispered, "She looks close with the baby." "She is," Rachel said, "closer than anyone else ever has been." Later that afternoon, as they packed up, Rachel turned to Clara. "I want you to know something," she said. "Yes, ma'am. You're not just staff. Not anymore." Clara's throat tightened. Rachel continued, "You're family." Clara stared at her for a long second, then smiled, not the polite, careful smile she had worn for years, but something deeper. "Real. Thank you, ma'am," she said softly. Rachel shook her head. "No more, ma'am. Just Rachel." Clara laughed gently. "I'll try." That night, Jonathan brought out something they hadn't used in years. The family camera. Not the phone, not the professional photographer, but the old digital camera they'd bought when they first got married. They set Madison down on a blanket, placed Clara beside her, and began taking pictures. Click. Madison giggling. Click. Clara laughing. Click. Rachel holding Clara's hand, without realizing it. Click. A moment that would one day hang in the center of their home, not because it was posed, but because it was true. And somewhere in the middle of that laughter, as the shutter kept clicking, Madison looked up and whispered a new word, clear as crystal. "Love." The room froze. Rachel gasped. Jonathan nearly dropped the camera. Clara's eyes welled up. Madison grinned. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she felt it, because for the first time, the house was no longer silent. It was full. A few weeks had passed since Madison had said her first words. Her energy returned. Her cheeks were full again. The sparkle in her eyes never seemed to fade. She babbled constantly now, bits of words, sounds, and giggles that made everyone stop and smile. Clara remained at the heart of it all. One afternoon, while Madison napped peacefully, Rachel entered the kitchen holding her phone. Her heels clicked softly against the tile, and her face carried an odd mix of excitement and nerves. "Clara," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't say no." Clara looked up from folding dish towels. "Of course, Rachel." Rachel exhaled. "There's a parenting magazine, one of the bigger ones. They want to do a feature on our story about Madison's recovery. But more than that, they want to interview you." Clara froze. "Me?" "Yes. I told them it was your voice that brought my daughter back. They want to hear from you, from your heart." Clara hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that." "You are," Rachel said gently. "You've been quiet too long." The interview was scheduled for the following Monday at the penthouse. Clara wore her best cardigan and polished her shoes until they shined. She braided her hair the way her mother had taught her as a girl and took the elevator up with hands trembling just slightly. The journalist was a kind woman named Joy. She greeted Clara warmly, then sat with her on the balcony, a recorder resting between them. I read everything Mrs. Montgomery told me. Joy began, "But I want to hear it from you." Clara folded her hands. "Well, I didn't do anything special. I just saw a child who needed love. That's all." Joy smiled. "Tell me about the lullaby." Clara nodded slowly. "It was passed down from my mother. A song she sang when the lights went out, when the world got heavy. It calms hearts, not just ears." Joy leaned in. "Did you ever feel afraid, being told not to speak?" Clara paused. "Yes, but not for myself. I was afraid for the baby. Afraid that silence would leave her feeling alone." Joy's eyes softened. "And when she called you Nana?" Clara's voice cracked just slightly. "It was the first time I felt like I belonged anywhere in a long time." The article was published 2 weeks later with the title, "The Voice That Saved a Millionaire's Daughter." It spread quickly. People across the city, and soon across the country, read Clara's story. Parents wrote letters. Teachers sent notes. Nannies and caregivers from all walks of life commented on social media, finally feeling seen. But more than that, it sparked conversations about presence, about compassion, about the people society too often keeps in the background. That weekend, Rachel hosted a small gathering at the penthouse to celebrate Madison's full recovery. But this time, Clara wasn't serving drinks or clearing plates. She was sitting at the center table. Guests asked her questions. A few brought their children just to hear her voice. Madison, dressed in a tiny blue dress, sat happily in Clara's lap the entire evening, ignoring everyone else. Rachel raised her glass and tapped it gently. "I want to make a toast," she said. The room quieted. "To Clara Simmons," she said, her voice shaking. "You walked into this house as a stranger, but you became the soul of our home. Thank you for teaching me how to be a mother." Everyone stood. Clara didn't. She was too busy rocking Madison gently, humming her lullaby, because even in a room full of applause, she knew who she sang for. It was a quiet Tuesday when the doorbell rang. The Montgomery household, now filled with warm routines and quiet laughter, had almost forgotten what tension felt like. Clara was in the nursery, reading a story to Madison, when Edwin approached with his usual measured voice. "There's someone downstairs asking for you, Miss Clara." Clara looked up. "Me?" Edwin nodded. "Says it's important." She handed Madison gently to Rachel, then followed Edwin to the private lobby. When the elevator opened, Clara's eyes widened. A woman stood there, mid-50s, with sharp cheekbones and a long tan coat. Her hair was tied back tight. She looked like she belonged on the cover of a leadership magazine. "Miss Clara Simmons?" the woman asked. "Yes, ma'am," Clara answered. The woman extended her hand. "My name is Vanessa Royston. I represent a foundation, the Golden Hearth Initiative. We promote and recognize unsung caregivers across the country. We read about you. We'd like to honor you at our annual banquet next month." Clara blinked. "Honor me? For what?" Vanessa smiled. "For reminding the world that love is a skill. And your voice, it changed a child's life. That matters." Clara was stunned. "I'm just a nanny," she said softly. Vanessa replied, "Exactly. And it's time the world understands what that really means." The next few days blurred by. The household buzzed with news of the invitation. Rachel insisted on taking Clara shopping for a new dress. Jonathan offered to hire a private driver. Even Madison, unaware of anything formal, seemed extra giggly whenever Clara walked into the room. But Clara remained quiet through it all, not hesitant, just grounded, because she knew what mattered. The title wasn't important. The attention wasn't the goal. What mattered was Madison. The night of the banquet arrived. The ballroom was golden, lit with chandeliers that sparkled like stars. Round tables filled with guests in black suits and satin gowns filled the space. At the front stood a podium beneath a massive screen bearing her name. Clara Simmons, the voice that healed. Clara sat at a table with the Montgomerys. Rachel wore silver. Jonathan wore black. And Madison, tucked in a special stroller, wore a tiny dress with sunflowers. When Clara's name was called, she stood slowly and walked the stage. The room went quiet as she stepped to the microphone. She looked out across the faces, strangers, donors, parents, caregivers. And then, toward the back of the room, she saw something she didn't expect. Her sister, her old friend from Georgia, a teacher she used to work with. They had come. Clara cleared her throat. "I wasn't supposed to speak," she began. "At least, that's what I was told when I started. That silence was a rule." A quiet murmur moved through the crowd. But sometimes silence is the very thing that breaks us. And a single voice, soft, patient, true, can be the thing that brings us back. She paused. "I sang to a baby who didn't know my name. And somehow she gave me one. She called me Nana." Clara swallowed hard. That was the first time I felt like someone saw me. Not as help, not as hired, but as needed. Applause began to rise. "But this isn't about me," she continued. "It's about every caregiver who's ever stayed late without asking for overtime. Every nanny who hummed lullabies in secret. Every grandmother who cooked in silence. Every heart that gave more than was paid for." She smiled gently. "I'm maybe just a voice, but I'm not quiet anymore." The room stood in a wave of applause. Rachel wiped her tears. Jonathan clapped until his hands hurt. And from the front row, Madison clapped too, tiny palms slapping together with all the force of someone who didn't understand the moment, but felt it, because love doesn't need a speech. It recognizes its own. Weeks passed after the award banquet. But the warmth it left never faded. The magazine features, the local news coverage, the endless letters from strangers, they all came and went like falling leaves. But what stayed was something deeper, quieter, something that didn't need headlines. Madison grew. She started crawling faster, then walking with wobbly steps. She said more words now, not just Nana and love, but little phrases that melted hearts. Up, Nana. Hug, Nana. Sing a song? Clara's lullaby became more than a song in that house. It was a tradition, a comfort, a family language. Even on mornings when Rachel or Jonathan tried to sing it themselves, Madison would still crawl to Clara's side, as if only she could make the melody feel right. One night, thunder rolled through the city, rain splashed against the windows, and lightning cracked across the skyline. Madison woke crying, loud, panicked sobs that shook the baby monitor on the dresser. Rachel and Jonathan jumped from their bed, rushing toward the nursery. But when they opened the door, Madison stood at the crib rail, arms outstretched, eyes wet and desperate. "Nana," she sobbed. Rachel froze. Jonathan whispered, "Go get her." Rachel hesitated. Then she ran. Clara arrived moments later, breathless, robe tied loosely over her nightgown. She stepped into the room and didn't speak. She simply picked Madison up and pressed her close. The crying stopped instantly. Clara rocked her gently, humming the lullaby, the same one, the only one. Rachel watched from the hallway, hand over her heart. The next morning, Clara found something surprising on her nightstand. It was a box, wrapped neatly in paper the color of dawn. Inside, a photo frame. The image was recent, taken at the banquet. Clara holding Madison, both smiling, but the frame itself told the story. Engraved at the bottom, in tiny silver letters, the one she chose first. Clara sat in silence for a long time. She had never been honored like that, not by awards, but by truth. That weekend, the family held a picnic in Central Park. Not for press, not for show, just for them. Madison toddled barefoot across the grass, chasing butterflies and babbling to herself. Clara sat on a blanket under a tree, unpacking lunch and watching over her with quiet joy. Rachel joined her with 2 glasses of iced tea. "She remembers more than we think," Rachel said suddenly. Clara looked up. Rachel smiled. "The way she looks at you, the way she calms when she hears your voice. That's not just habit. It's memory, deep memory." Clara stared across the grass at Madison. "She'll forget my words one day, but I hope she never forgets the feeling." "She won't," Rachel said, "because I won't let her." A few moments later, Madison came wobbling back toward them, cheeks flushed and laughter spilling from her tiny lips. She collapsed into Clara's lap, clutching a dandelion. "F.O. you, Nana." Clara held the flower delicately. "Thank you, baby." Then Madison pointed to the sky. "Sing a song," she said, and Clara did, right there under the tree, while the wind moved gently through the leaves, and Rachel closed her eyes to listen, because it was never just a lullaby. It was the sound of something finally coming home. Summer turned into fall. Madison was now walking confidently, forming full sentences with surprising clarity. Her voice carried joy wherever she went, echoing to the penthouse halls that were once so quiet. She had grown stronger, braver, brighter, and at the center of it all was still Clara. But time, as always, was moving, and Clara, though deeply cherished, had begun to feel a shift. Rachel had become more involved than ever in Madison's day-to-day life. Jonathan took calls from the nursery now, not from his study. Even Edwin smiled more. And Clara, well, she started stepping back just slightly, letting Madison run to Rachel first, watching from a short distance instead of always being the one to lead. Not out of sadness, but pride. It was working. They had become a family in the truest sense. One morning, while Clara was packing a small bag for Madison's weekend visit to her grandparents, Rachel entered the room holding an envelope. "I need to talk to you," she said gently. Clara turned. "Yes." Rachel stepped forward. "Jonathan and we've been talking, and we want to do something." She held out the envelope. Clara took it. Inside was a letter, legal-looking, with words Clara didn't expect. "You want to set up a trust?" she asked slowly. Rachel nodded. "For you and for your family. For everything you've done and still do. This home, our daughter, our lives, they wouldn't be what they are without you." Clara stared at the paper, overwhelmed. Rachel continued, "It's not about paying you. It's about recognizing what you are to us. You're not just part of Madison's past. You're part of her future." Clara's throat tightened. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll stay. As long as you want. Not as an employee. As family." That night, Clara sat at her small desk in her bedroom, the room they had redesigned just for her after the banquet. A quilt Rachel had sewn herself draped across the bed. Madison's crayon drawings decorated the wall. Her name, Nana, was scribbled in block letters above the headboard. She read the letter again. Then she looked around. This time, she didn't feel like a visitor. She felt home. The next day, Clara told Rachel she needed a week off, a personal trip. Rachel agreed immediately, though a hint of worry crept across her face. "You'll come back, right?" she asked. Clara smiled. "Of course I will. I just need to see someone." Rachel nodded. "We'll be waiting." Clara took the train south, back to Georgia. She visited her mother's old grave, sat under the same willow tree where she first learned that lullaby. She hummed it into the wind, imagining it carrying all the way back to Madison's crib. She also visited a small school where she used to volunteer long ago. There, she met a young woman raising 2 kids on her own, working 2 jobs and barely making rent. She reminded Clara of herself. Clara handed her an envelope. "No strings," she said. "Just pass the kindness forward when you can." Then she returned to New York, to her real family. When Clara opened the door to the Montgomery penthouse, Madison screamed with delight. "Nanny!" She ran across the room in socks, leaped into Clara's arms, and whispered into her neck, "I missed you so much." Clara held her close, smiling through tears. "I missed you more." Years passed. The penthouse remained high above the city, watching seasons shift like pages in a slow-turning book. Inside, everything changed, and yet somehow everything stayed the same. Madison grew. She was 7 now, bold, clever, with a love for art and a mind full of curiosity. Her favorite class was music. She could already play a simple melody on the piano and had started writing songs of her own. Every note she played was soft and careful, like the lullabies she grew up hearing. Every single morning before school, she had one rule: "Nana sings me out the door." And Clara did. Same doorway, same smile, same gentle tune whispered to the halls as Madison pulled on her coat and reached for her lunchbox. Rachel, now sitting on the board of a local children's foundation, often told Clara's story at fundraising events. "She taught me how to raise my daughter," she'd say with pride. "Not through books, not through advice, but through love." Jonathan, though still busy, never again allowed himself to miss a single recital or birthday. He'd learned that presence was louder than money. And Clara? She stayed. Not because she had to, but because she was wanted. She still kept her old brown bag, though Rachel had offered to replace it 100 times. She still hummed a lullaby during laundry, still baked cornbread on rainy days. But now, she also had a new role. She was on the board of the Golden Hearth Initiative. She spoke at schools. She mentored young caregivers. When asked what changed her life, she always gave the same answer: "A baby girl who wouldn't eat unless I sang." One spring afternoon, Clara sat alone on the park bench just down the street from the penthouse. A light breeze stirred the cherry blossoms above. She closed her eyes and tilted her face toward the sun. A small hand slipped into hers. It was Madison, now tall enough to look her in the eyes. "You okay, Nana?" Clara smiled. "Just resting." "Can I sit with you?" "Always." They sat together in silence until Madison pulled out a folded sheet of paper from her coat pocket. "I wrote a song," she said, "at school." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Oh, it's about you." Clara's breath caught. Madison unfolded the paper and cleared her throat. The song was short, just a verse and chorus. But the melody, it was familiar. It was a lullaby, woven into new words, a new rhythm, a new voice. But it was hers, passed down, remembered. Clara wiped a tear as Madison finished. I think it's the best thing I've ever written, Madison said shyly. Clara reached over, cupped her cheek. I think it's the best thing I've ever heard. They sat a while longer, the paper between them fluttering in the breeze. And as the sun began to dip behind the buildings, Madison leaned against Clara's shoulder and whispered, "You think I'll always remember the song?" Clara didn't answer. She just started humming. The same lullaby, the one that fed a baby, the one that healed a home, the one that, even as the world moved forward, stayed exactly where it belonged, right in the heart